I stood in the middle of a courtroom that smelled like old wood and cold air, my palms damp against the table in front of me. The state flag hung heavy behind the judge, its colors dull under the fluorescent lights. My uniform was gone. Today I wore a plain navy suit, pressed and perfect, the way I had been taught to present myself before my commanding officer. But there was no pride in me, only a slow, quiet ache that started deep in my chest and spread like frost. My name was on the case file, Sergeant Nora Ellis, United States Army Medical Corps. The charge read neglect and assault of an elderly dependent. The dependent was my own mother. I watched her as she sat on the witness stand. Her gray hair was pinned back neatly, her hands folded in her lap like a woman praying. She wouldn't look at me, not once. The lawyer beside her leaned in close and whispered something. She nodded, then she spoke. Her voice was thin but steady. Yes. I remember falling. She was the only one in the house. She got angry when I called for help. My heart gave a short stutter. The room tilted slightly, not from shock, but from disbelief that had already run out of energy. She said it again, louder this time, as if she had rehearsed it. She pushed me. The words landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. A hush fell over the courtroom. Somewhere in the back row, someone coughed. The prosecutor smiled faintly. Satisfied, my attorney scribbled notes and leaned toward me, whispering, "Stay calm, Sergeant, let it pass." I didn't move. Training had taught me how to stand still under fire, how to control my breath when chaos exploded around me. But this was a different kind of battlefield. There were no explosions, no screams, only quiet voices slicing through me like small, precise blades. The judge's gavel tapped once. He was an older man, firm face, neutral. Proceed. The prosecutor rose again, his tie a little too bright, his steps measured and confident. He asked questions that weren't really questions. "So you're saying your daughter had a temper?" My mother hesitated. Her lips trembled slightly before she said, "Yes, sometimes." That was enough. The man turned toward the jury, a gesture I had seen soldiers use when they knew the mission was already won. He built a picture of me that I barely recognized. A woman hardened by war, trained to control pain but not emotion, prone to anger, to violence. I wanted to shout, to explain how she had tripped on the corner rug, how I had caught her before she hit the table, how I had called the ambulance myself. But I could not interrupt. Courtroom decorum was another kind of discipline, one that required silence as armor. When the judge called for a short recess, I finally exhaled. The sound that came out was not relief, but something raw and low, almost a growl held deep in my throat. Outside the courtroom, I sat on a bench near the vending machines. The hallway buzzed with low voices and the echo of footsteps. I stared at the floor tiles, tracing the thin cracks that ran between them. My mother used to complain about cracks in her kitchen tiles back home, saying they collected dust no matter how much she scrubbed. The memory stung. I used to scrub those same floors too. I thought about how strange it was that small details could feel sharper than gunfire. A lawyer sat beside me, a calm man with soft eyes. "They're building a narrative," he said quietly. "Don't let it get under your skin. We'll show the medical report, the call log, facts will hold." I nodded because that was what soldiers do when orders are given, but I knew facts weren't enough. Stories win battles, not data. Thomas, my stepfather, had taught me that the hard way. He could twist truth into a shape that suited him, smooth as a bullet sliding into a chamber. I saw the same shape now forming in my mother's silence. When we went back inside, the seats were filled again. The fluorescent lights hummed above, the air still cold. The prosecutor began playing an audio recording of the emergency call I had made that night. My voice sounded distant and too calm. "My mother fell," I said on the tape. "She hit her shoulder. She's breathing, but she's in pain." The prosecutor paused the recording. "You sound calm, Sergeant." "Too calm for someone who just hurt their mother, wouldn't you say?" He smiled again. The jurors looked uneasy. I could feel the heat rise behind my eyes, the pulse climbing in my neck. I wanted to say, "Calm saves lives, panic kills," but I stayed still. The defense tried to counter with hospital records. The doctor's notes showed no signs of forced trauma, only a simple fracture consistent with a fall. Yet somehow the narrative kept slipping away from truth. It was as if gravity itself had shifted. Each time the prosecutor spoke, the world tilted toward guilt. My mother sat with her head bowed. I could not tell if she was ashamed or afraid. At one point, the judge asked if I had anything to say. I stood, my knees locked for a second, then steadied. My voice came out quiet but clear. "Your Honor, I have served 8 years in the United States Army. I have seen men torn apart by war and held their hands until they stopped shaking. I have never lifted a hand in anger at anyone, not once. The only thing I am guilty of is trying to keep my mother safe." The courtroom stayed silent. The judge nodded slightly, expression unreadable. Then he said, "We will reconvene tomorrow." His gavel fell again, the sound echoing off the paneled walls. When the session ended, people filed out quickly. No one looked at me. Reporters whispered in the corner, their cameras already down. My mother left through the side door, led by a court officer. For a second, our eyes almost met, but she turned away. The moment folded in on itself, like paper burning at the edges. Outside, the sky was a flat gray, the kind that made the world feel smaller. I stood on the courthouse steps, the wind cold against my face. A group of veterans passed by on the sidewalk, laughing about something, their jackets marked with old unit patches. I wanted to call out to them, to say I was one of them, but my voice stayed trapped somewhere behind the weight in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of papers from my lawyer. Each page was filled with lines and boxes and signatures, none of which could explain how a mother could call her own child a liar. I poured a cup of coffee, then left it untouched. The only sound in the apartment was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a question I couldn't answer. When dawn came, I went for a run. The streets were empty, wet from a light drizzle. My shoulder ached from an old field injury, the kind of pain that flares up when memories do. As I ran past the old train station, a freight engine thundered by, shaking the ground beneath me. The vibration filled my chest, and for a moment the noise drowned out everything else. I thought about the day I left for basic training. My mother had hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She told me I was brave, that I would make her proud. Somewhere between that moment and this courtroom, something had broken. Maybe it was fear, maybe guilt. Maybe she had never really known me at all. I slowed down, breath fogging in the morning air. In the distance, the courthouse dome glinted faintly in the weak sunlight. I stopped, hands on my knees, the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. For the first time since the trial began, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not grief, determination. This wasn't over. If you believe that truth can stand even when the world turns its back, hit the like button and share this story. The next part will reveal what really happened that night and why silence can sometimes be the loudest weapon of all. The next morning, the courtroom felt colder. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way the air carried that quiet tension like before a storm. I walked in early, my steps steady, boots silent on the polished floor. Every movement was muscle memory now. The army had trained me to control fear, but it had never trained me to face betrayal like this. My mother was already seated, her eyes fixed on the empty witness box. When she saw me, her expression didn't change. No anger, no softness, just a wall. My lawyer leaned close. He whispered that the prosecution was bringing in a neighbor as a witness, someone who claimed they had heard shouting that night. I nodded, not surprised. In truth, there had been shouting. My mother had slipped and cried out. I shouted her name and rushed from the laundry room to the kitchen. But truth can't compete with the echo of lies once they start spreading. When the hearing began, the neighbor, Mrs. Carter, took the stand. She was kind to me once, used to wave when I mowed the yard before my deployments. She looked uncomfortable now, clutching her purse. The prosecutor's voice softened as if coaxing a frightened child. "You heard yelling that night, didn't you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I heard her mother scream, then I heard the daughter shouting something." "Can you recall what she said?" he asked. "I think it stopped moving or something like that." The prosecutor turned to the jury with a satisfied nod. When my lawyer cross-examined her, he asked if she had seen anything. She admitted she hadn't, she had only heard. The sound, she said, could have been the television. That small truth barely made a ripple. Perception is a strange kind of weapon. It doesn't need to be accurate, only repeated. I sat still, eyes forward. My mother's hands trembled slightly on her lap. The prosecutor kept glancing at her, guiding her with questions that sounded rehearsed. "Linda, when your daughter raised her voice, did you feel afraid?" She blinked, confused, and looked toward the judge. "I was startled," she said, "but she didn't mean to hurt me." That one line cracked the air. The prosecutor tensed. My lawyer noticed it too. For a brief second, I saw the woman who had raised me. Then she lowered her eyes again, retreating behind the same quiet that had protected her for years. When court adjourned for lunch, I stepped outside into the pale sunlight. A news van idled across the street. The reporter held a microphone, waiting for a statement. I kept walking. The smell of street coffee mixed with car exhaust filled the air, familiar and grounding. A man in uniform passed by and gave me a polite nod. He didn't know me, but that gesture was enough to remind me who I was. I found a small diner a block away and sat in the corner booth. The waitress poured coffee and asked if I wanted food. I said no. My hands still shook slightly, so I cupped them around the mug for warmth. On the TV above the counter, the local news was already playing a segment about the trial. My name appeared on the ticker, my face from an old deployment photo beside the headline, "Army Sergeant Accused of Elder Abuse." The customers glanced up, then back down at their meals. That was all it took to make someone a villain, a few seconds of edited truth. I turned away from the screen and watched the reflection in the window. The courthouse dome stood across the street, its shape warped by the glass. My reflection looked older than I remembered. War does that, so does heartbreak. I thought of my unit back at Fort Sam Houston, the friends who still messaged me, asking if I was all right. I hadn't answered them. How could I explain that home felt more hostile than any battlefield I had known? When we returned for the afternoon session, the prosecutor moved fast. He questioned my motives, brought up my military service record, even implied that my time in combat had made me unstable. My lawyer objected, but the seed was already planted. The jurors shifted in their seats. People love heroes, but they also love to watch them fall. The judge called a brief recess. I used the time to breathe. Standing near the window in the hallway, I looked out over the parking lot. The wind moved through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the asphalt. I tried to remember the sound of my mother's laugh when I was a kid. It had been years since I heard it. War had stolen so much from me, but her silence had stolen more. When court resumed, my lawyer called me to the stand. He told me to answer calmly, truthfully, just as I would in a debriefing. I took the oath, the words familiar like a command. Then I sat back straight, eyes steady. He asked about my service. 8 years in, 2 tours overseas, Army Medical Corps. I told the jury about the medics' rule we lived by: assess, stabilize, protect. That's what I had done the night my mother fell. Assess her condition, stabilize her, protect her. I explained the call I made to emergency services, how I had followed protocol step by step. The courtroom was quiet. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty on the prosecutor's face. He rose for cross-examination. Sergeant Ellis, isn't it true that soldiers often have trouble adjusting to civilian life? I met his eyes. We adjust by surviving, sir, same as anyone else. And you were tired that night, weren't you? He pressed. Stressed, maybe angry. No, I said, just concerned. But your mother claims you shouted at her. I nodded slightly. I did shout. I told her to stop moving because she was bleeding. That's what medics do when someone is hurt. We take control of chaos. He paused, taken aback by the firmness of my tone. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't lower it either. The truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to stand its ground. As I stepped down from the stand, the judge dismissed the session for the day. My lawyer whispered that I had done well. I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. The kind of emptiness that follows when you realize the fight isn't just for freedom or justice anymore. It's for your own name. Outside, the evening light cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Reporters waited again, cameras ready. I ignored them. A small boy with a backpack was walking beside his mother, holding her hand. She laughed at something he said. I caught that sound in my chest like a knife twisting slowly. That night, I sat in my apartment with the window open, the hum of city noise drifting in. I thought about calling my mother just to hear her voice. I didn't. There was nothing left to say. I opened the old wooden box where I kept my service medals. The metal caught the moonlight, dull and quiet. At the bottom lay my dog tags. I ran my thumb over the engraved letters. Name, blood type, branch, proof that I existed beyond the lies. Somewhere inside me, a small flame of resolve started to burn again. If the world wanted to see a villain, I would let them watch. And when the truth came out, they would remember what real honor looks like. If you want to know what happens when the silence finally breaks and the truth steps into the light, make sure to subscribe and stay close. The next chapter will reveal the night everything began and why some wounds leave scars that no uniform can hide. I was 9 the first time I understood what silence could do. It wasn't peace. It wasn't safety. It was power. The kind that smothers you slowly until you stop fighting back. That summer, my mother remarried, and a man named Frank moved into our small house at the edge of town. He was neat, polite, and generous in front of neighbors, the kind of man who waved to everyone and mowed the lawn at sunrise. But behind closed doors, he carried a temper that lived right under his skin. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened whenever something wasn't where he left it. He never yelled the way people imagine. He didn't need to. He used tone and quietness like weapons. I remember one night when he came home late from work, his face red and tired. My mother asked about his day. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to me and asked why my shoes were near the door. I said I was about to clean them for school. He looked at me for a long time and said, "You live in this house now. That means you follow my order, not your own." Then he walked away. My mother didn't speak. She just pressed her hands together the way she always did when she was nervous. It started small. The thermostat had to be set to 70 exactly. The TV volume to 12. Dinner at 6 sharp. He would walk around the house after every meal, running a finger along the counter or window frame if he found dust. He would call me into the room and stare until I apologized for something I didn't understand. My mother said he was strict because he cared. She said he believed in discipline, but I knew discipline. I learned it years later in uniform, and it never looked like that. At first, I tried to please him. I thought if I could be perfect, he might leave me alone. I got straight A's. I cleaned until my hands cracked from the bleach. But perfection didn't earn peace. It only raised the bar higher. One evening, he accused me of disrespect because I didn't look him in the eye when he spoke. The truth was I couldn't. His stare was the kind that made you feel smaller just for existing. He grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark. Then he smiled and said he was teaching me strength. My mother stood in the doorway, frozen. She didn't stop him. She didn't say a word. After that, I stopped talking much at all. I learned to read moods instead of faces, footsteps instead of voices. Silence became my armor. When teachers asked how things were at home, I smiled and said fine. At night, I would lie in bed listening to the sound of the refrigerator hum and imagine what it would be like to live in a place where noise meant laughter. Sometimes I'd whisper stories to myself about running away, but even my own voice sounded wrong inside that house. By the time I was 16, I had a part-time job at the grocery store. It was the only place I could breathe. One afternoon, while restocking a shelf, I saw a recruiting poster on the bulletin board near the door. A woman in combat uniform stood beneath bold letters that read "Be More." I stared at it for a long time. She looked confident, strong, free. I wanted that. That night, when I mentioned the army to my mother, she flinched. Frank laughed and said, "The military doesn't need girls who can't even stand up straight." I said nothing, but inside something cracked open. A month later, I met with a recruiter. He told me about the medical corps, about how combat medics save lives under pressure. The idea of being useful, of doing something that mattered, was like air after years of drowning. When I signed the enlistment papers, I didn't feel fear. I felt weight lifting off me. My mother cried the day I left, clutching the kitchen counter as if letting go of me would make the house collapse. Frank shook my hand, his smile polite and hollow. I could tell he thought I'd fail. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston hit me like a second birth. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and disinfectant. Drill sergeants barked commands that bounced off concrete walls. For the first time, silence didn't mean fear. It meant focus. I learned how to listen to orders and to my own breath. The discipline that once suffocated me now built something solid inside. I still remember my first combat medical exercise, dragging a fellow trainee through fake smoke while gunfire echoed from speakers. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else, yet for the first time in my life, I felt in control. The days blurred into weeks. We learned to apply tourniquets, manage bleeding, intubate under pressure. It was brutal and beautiful. The first time I inserted in Roman 4 correctly, my instructor nodded and said, "That's how you keep someone alive." I carried those words like a medal long before I earned one. In those moments, I began to understand that healing people didn't mean being weak. It meant courage, the kind that doesn't shout. Then came deployment. Afghanistan. Heat so dry it burned your throat. Sand that got into everything, even your sleep. I was assigned to a forward operating base in Helmand province. My unit worked long hours under constant tension. Some days nothing happened. Other days everything happened at once. The first time we took fire, I was in the field hospital stitching up a young private with shrapnel in his thigh. The alarm went off and we hit the ground. I could hear the whine of mortars outside, the radio chatter, the sound of my own heartbeat. I finished the stitch before I ran for cover. You don't think about fear when you're trained to act. You think about sequence, pressure, bandage, transport. When the dust settled, we were covered in sweat and grit, but we were alive. That night, I sat outside the tent watching the desert sky. Stars scattered across the black like someone had spilled light. I thought of my mother then, wondering if she ever looked up and thought of me. I wondered if silence felt different to her now. After 6 months, I was part of a convoy that hit an improvised explosive device. The blast flipped the vehicle ahead of us. I ran toward it without thinking. Inside were 3 soldiers, 2 conscious, 1 not breathing. Training took over. I opened the airway, started compressions, shouted for medic bag. My hands shook, but my rhythm held steady. After what felt like forever, the man gasped. The whole world shrank to that sound. Later, our commanding officer told me I had saved his life. He gave me a small commendation pin. I didn't care about the medal. I cared that the man lived. When I returned home months later, the air smelled different, quieter somehow. The house where I grew up looked smaller. Frank had left by then. My mother told me he moved out after an argument and never came back. She said it like she was describing the weather. I nodded. I wanted to ask why she stayed so long, but the words caught in my throat. Silence was our language, and neither of us knew how to translate it anymore. For a while, I thought maybe we could rebuild something. We went to lunch a few times, exchanged small talk. She asked about the army but didn't listen to the answers. Still, I was grateful for even that. Then one afternoon, she tripped in the kitchen. I helped her up, she laughed, and I thought maybe things were finally turning. A week later came the fall that changed everything. If this part of the story speaks to you, hit like and share it with someone who understands what it means to rebuild yourself from silence. The next part will show how that quiet house turned into the scene of everything that came after, and why some ghosts never leave even when the doors are open. The fall that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because it was the only day that week the light came through the kitchen window just right, soft and golden, warming the countertop where my mother liked to chop vegetables. I had stopped by after work to drop off groceries and check in on her. She had gotten thinner, slower, but her stubbornness hadn't aged a day. She was reaching for a pan on the top shelf when her foot caught the edge of the rug. I turned just in time to see her slip. The pan clattered to the floor and she hit her shoulder against the counter. I rushed forward, heart racing, and caught her before she went down completely. She winced but smiled like it was nothing. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered. I helped her to a chair, grabbed some ice, and examined the bruise forming along her arm. Years of field medicine made the assessment automatic. I asked her to move her fingers. She could. "Though it hurt, you might have strained a tendon," I said. "You need to see a doctor." She brushed me off, said she didn't need hospitals. I dialed the local clinic anyway. The nurse on call told me to bring her in for an x-ray. My mother frowned. "You always overreact," she said. I smiled, trying to keep it light. "That's what keeps people alive, Mom." At the clinic, the doctor confirmed a minor fracture. She'd need a sling and rest. I took a few days off work to help around the house. It felt almost peaceful cooking meals for her, walking her to the porch in the evenings. She seemed softer, even laughed once when I burned the toast. For a moment, I thought maybe we had turned a corner. Maybe this was our second chance, but old habits die hard, and silence has a way of sneaking back in when words are most needed. A week later, I found out she had been speaking to Frank again. He'd called her after years of disappearing. I overheard her on the phone one morning, her voice small and careful, the way it used to be around him. I didn't say anything, but a cold feeling settled in my stomach. When I asked if she was all right, she said he just wanted to check on me. I nodded, though I didn't believe her. Frank had a way of getting under her skin, of planting doubt like a weed that spread quietly until it took over everything. That evening, while I was washing dishes, I heard her in the living room talking again, this time louder. "She's overbearing," she said. "She treats me like a patient." I froze. Then silence. When I stepped into the room, she hung up quickly. I wanted to ask who she was talking to, but I didn't. Instead, I gathered my things and went home, my chest heavy. The next day I called to check on her. No answer. The day after that, a neighbor called me saying she had fallen again. I drove there fast, heart pounding. The ambulance was already in the driveway. She sat on a stretcher, her face pale. I asked what happened. She said she tripped again, but her tone was distant, rehearsed. I followed the paramedics to the hospital. She had another fracture, worse this time. She refused to stay overnight and insisted on going home. The doctor asked if she lived alone. She said yes. I didn't correct her. That night I stayed with her anyway. I sat in the chair beside her bed, listening to her breathe. The house creaked, the clock ticked, and somewhere outside a dog barked. Around midnight she stirred and said quietly, "He told me you blame me for everything." I turned toward her. "Who did?" I asked, though I already knew. She didn't answer. She rolled over, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The conversation ended there, swallowed by silence. The next morning she wouldn't look at me. When I tried to help her up, she said she wanted to manage on her own. I respected it, left her breakfast, and told her I'd check in later. By afternoon, my phone rang. It was the police. They said there had been an incident, that my mother was hurt, that I needed to come in. When I arrived, she was sitting in her living room, arm bandaged, eyes glassy. The officer said she claimed I had pushed her during an argument. My breath caught. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the room felt too tight. I tried to speak, but the words got tangled. They didn't arrest me, not yet, but the report was filed and everything began to unravel. My mother wouldn't explain. She said she didn't remember clearly, that things happened fast. The neighbors told the police they heard shouting. Frank called me that night. I hadn't heard his voice in years, but I recognized the cold satisfaction immediately. "You finally showed her who you really are," he said before hanging up. I sat on the floor for a long time, staring at the silent phone. A week later, the summons arrived. Neglect and assault of an elderly dependent. The paper looked almost clean in my hands, crisp edges, black ink. I thought about the years I had spent patching up soldiers in deserts and mountains, the lives saved. The chaos endured. And now here I was, accused of hurting the one person I had sworn to protect. I didn't cry. I packed a small bag, ironed my suit, and called my lawyer. That night, before I went to bed, I opened the wooden box with my medals again. The dog tags caught the light from the lamp. I held them until my hands stopped shaking. They were more than metal. They were proof that silence had raised me but hadn't broken me. If you have ever felt accused of something your heart knows it didn't do, hit the like button and leave a comment. In the next chapter, the trial begins again, but this time the truth starts to find its way through the cracks that silence left behind. The third morning of the trial began with the same pale gray sky that had followed me all week. The courthouse steps were slick with dew, the kind that made the concrete shine like glass. I took them slowly, breathing in the cold air, steadying myself before walking through the tall wooden doors. Inside, the same people waited, the prosecutor with his crisp suit and rehearsed smirk, the judge behind his heavy desk. The jurors avoided my eyes, and my mother was sitting at the front, her hands folded neatly on her lap. I had worn the same navy suit each day, pressed and plain. My dog tags hung beneath the collar, hidden from view. I told myself they were there to remind me who I was, not what I had lost. The prosecutor wasted no time. He rose and began pacing in front of the jury, his voice smooth, controlled, dangerous in its calm. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard testimony that Sergeant Ellis has served overseas, that she has seen combat and that she has been trained to respond under stress. But the question before you is simple. What happens when that training follows her home? He turned toward me. Soldiers are taught to control chaos, but what happens when they can't? He looked at me like a man daring me to break. My lawyer objected. The judge overruled. The prosecutor leaned closer to the jury again. You heard from the neighbor. You heard from the victim herself. There was shouting, there was injury, and there was fear. We are not here to question her military service. We are here to question her temper. He paused for effect, her aggression. The word hung in the air. I could almost feel it settle on my shoulders like weight. Aggression. It was the same word Frank used years ago when I raised my voice after he slammed a door in my face. The same word my mother repeated later, when silence had become easier than standing up for me. I sat still, jaw tight, hands folded in front of me. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the lights above. My lawyer stood and began his cross-examination, but the prosecutor had already planted his seed. Every question now sounded like defense, not truth. He asked the same things from different angles, turning the story like a prism, making the same facts reflect a darker light. He mentioned PTSD. He mentioned adjustment issues. He said I had been treated once for insomnia after deployment. I nodded when asked. Yes, I had trouble sleeping. No, I was never violent. Yes, I saw a counselor. No, I never hurt anyone. The questions kept coming, one after another, until I couldn't tell if I was answering or just surviving them. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. My voice felt small at first, but steadied as I continued. I joined the army because I wanted to help people. I trained to treat wounds, to save lives, to bring soldiers home who might not have made it otherwise. That training doesn't vanish when you leave the battlefield. It becomes part of you. Every action I took that night was instinct, not anger. My mother fell. I caught her. I called for help. That's all there is. The judge nodded once, then motioned for me to sit. My mother's lawyer whispered something to her. She hesitated, then looked at me for the first time in days. Her eyes were wet, uncertain, but she said nothing. Her silence echoed louder than any accusation. The prosecutor pulled out a photo of my mother's bruised shoulder and held it up for the court to see. This, he said, is what happens when strength becomes rage. My lawyer objected again, citing lack of proof. The judge allowed it as visual evidence. I looked at the photo. I had seen worse wounds, deeper cuts, bodies torn apart by explosions. But this one broke me more than any battlefield, not because of the injury, but because of what it meant. The day dragged. The air inside the courtroom grew heavy. I could feel sweat at the base of my neck, my heartbeat slow and deliberate. When my lawyer handed me a folder to review the medical records, I opened it carefully. The paper cool against my fingers. That was when it happened. As I leaned forward, the chain around my neck slipped free. My dog tags fell against the table with a soft metallic sound, not loud but clear enough to draw every eye. The sunlight from the tall window caught the surface, sending a sharp glint across the room. The judge's head turned first. His expression froze mid-motion. For a second, no one moved. I reached for them, meaning to tuck them back under my collar. But his voice stopped me. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "those are yours." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Please continue." But he didn't look away. The jurors whispered among themselves. The prosecutor cleared his throat, visibly uneasy. I could sense the shift, small but real. That sound, that light, had reminded everyone of something they had almost forgotten: service, sacrifice. Then from the back of the courtroom, a chair scraped the floor. I turned. A man in a gray suit stood up, tall and steady. His hair was silver, his posture unmistakable. Recognition came before his name: Brigadier General Harris. I hadn't seen him since Helmand Province, the day his vehicle hit an IED and we dragged him out under fire. He walked down the aisle without being called. The bailiff hesitated, but the judge lifted his hand, allowing him forward. The general stopped beside the witness stand, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I realize this is irregular, but I can't stay silent." The judge tilted his head slightly. "Proceed." Harris looked at me, then at the jury. "That soldier," he said, pointing toward me, "saved my life and the lives of 2 men in my command. I watched her crawl through debris with shrapnel in her leg to keep us breathing. I owe her my life, we all do. His voice never wavered. If you're here to judge her character, then know this: courage doesn't vanish when the uniform comes off. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My lawyer exhaled softly beside me. The prosecutor looked pale, his papers trembling slightly in his hand. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped. "General Harris, you were not on the witness list," he said. "I am aware," the general replied, "but truth doesn't always wait for permission." I sat there frozen, my throat tight, tears burning behind my eyes but refusing to fall. My mother's face had gone completely still. For the first time, she seemed to see me not as her daughter, but as someone she didn't recognize, someone real. The judge called a brief recess. As people began to move, General Harris turned to me. "You still wear them," he said, nodding toward the dog tags. I nodded back. "They remind me what silence can cost," I said quietly. He gave a faint smile. "Then make sure it doesn't cost you again." He turned and walked out before I could answer. That night, the court adjourned earlier than expected, outside. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions, lights flashing. My lawyer shielded me as we moved through the crowd. I didn't respond to anyone. My thoughts were somewhere else, back in that field of dust and fire where Harris had nearly died, where I learned that saving someone often means losing a piece of yourself. If this moment caught you off guard the way it did me, take a second to hit like and share this story. The next part reveals what happened when the courtroom fell silent again, and the truth finally began to turn everything upside down. When the hearing resumed that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that words couldn't quite explain. The jurors' faces looked different, not softer exactly, but awake. The prosecutor spoke again, but his sentences no longer carried the same sharp edge. Every argument he made seemed to echo back at him. The story he had built of a violent soldier unable to control herself was cracking. One testimony from a man in uniform had done what hours of legal defense could not. Truth had entered the room, and it refused to leave. My lawyer began the defense presentation with quiet confidence. He replayed the security footage from the neighbor's porch camera, the one that captured the moments after my mother's fall. There was no shouting, no struggle, only me lifting her, guiding her toward a chair, my hands steady. The prosecutor objected to the quality of the video, saying it didn't show everything. The judge waved him off. "We see enough," he said. Then came the medical records. The fracture on my mother's arm was consistent with a fall, not an impact. The attending physician's report used words like accidental, low velocity, common in elderly patients. My lawyer asked the doctor to clarify on the stand. He did, precise and calm. The prosecutor looked down at his notes. The rhythm of his questioning gone. Still, the hardest part wasn't the evidence. It was watching my mother sit there, silent, eyes unfocused, her hands trembling in her lap. I kept waiting for her to say something, anything, but she didn't. She just looked small, lost. When the judge called her back to the stand, the courtroom went quiet again. She took the oath with a voice barely audible. My lawyer approached gently. "Mrs. Ellis, do you remember the night of the incident?" She nodded faintly. "Did your daughter hurt you?" She hesitated. The silence stretched. Finally, she said, "I don't know." My heart sank. He nodded. "Did she ever raise her voice?" "Sometimes," she whispered, "but not that night." He asked her about Frank. Her shoulders stiffened. "He called," she said softly. "He told me things, that she was angry, that the army had changed her." She paused, staring at her hands. "He said she would hurt me one day." My lawyer asked how long they had been in contact. "A few weeks," she said, voice cracking. "I thought he just wanted to check on me." The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but the judge motioned for him to wait. My mother looked toward me for the first time, her eyes red. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said quietly. "I thought if I said she pushed me, maybe she'd come home, maybe she'd stop being so far away." The room felt like it stopped breathing. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, objecting again, arguing that she was confused, that her memory was compromised. But the damage was done. The truth had broken through. I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired, bone-deep tired, like every breath I'd been holding since childhood had finally escaped all at once. The judge leaned back, hands folded. "We will recess for deliberation," he said. The gavel hit the desk, and the sound echoed like a final heartbeat. Outside the courthouse, the light was starting to fade. The reporters were still there, but their questions sounded different now, softer. One asked if I had anything to say about the general's statement. I said no. Another asked if I would forgive my mother. I paused, then said, "I think forgiveness is part of the battle, not the end of it." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window in my apartment, watching the city lights blink like distant signals. I thought about Afghanistan again, about the noise of helicopters, the chaos, the rush of adrenaline. But most of all, I thought about the silence that always followed after the mission was done. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but empty. That was what this felt like. The verdict came the next morning. The jury found me not guilty on all charges. When the judge read the words, my body didn't move. Relief didn't come like a flood. It came slow, quiet, like the first breath after being underwater too long. My lawyer squeezed my arm, whispering something about justice. I just nodded. As I walked out, General Harris was waiting near the steps. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his grip steady. "You did well, Sergeant," he said. I shook my head. "You did, sir. You spoke when no one else did." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes that's what leadership is, using your voice when others have lost theirs." He looked out over the crowd of reporters. "You remind them what the uniform really means." Behind us, my mother stood alone at the bottom of the stairs. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen. She looked at me like she didn't know whether to come closer or turn away, for a long moment. Neither of us moved. Then I walked toward her. She started to speak, but I stopped her with a small gesture. "It's all right," I said quietly. "You don't have to explain." She nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," I said. We stood there, two women shaped by the same silence, each trying to unlearn it in our own way. I didn't know what forgiveness would look like, but I knew it would have to start there at the courthouse steps, with the world watching and not understanding. If you've ever had to stand alone for what's right, even when the people you love don't stand beside you, like this video, and share it with someone who needs strength tonight. In the next chapter, I'll tell you what happened after the verdict, when the Army called again, and I had to decide whether to return to service or finally make peace with home. The next morning, the courthouse was different. The reporters had gathered again, but their voices were quieter, as if they knew the air inside was about to hold something heavy. I walked in with steady steps, my lawyer beside me. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted in their seats, the murmurs rising and fading like the tide. My mother sat near the front again, her hands gripping a folded tissue. I didn't know if she would speak. I didn't expect her to. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. The prosecutor began first, trying to regain control of the narrative. He stood tall, his voice crisp, the rhythm of his words measured. "Your Honor, the defense has brought forward an emotional testimony, but we cannot let sentiment replace fact." He paused and turned toward the jury. "We are here to determine responsibility, not reputation." He was trying to steady the ground beneath his feet, but the cracks were already there. The general's words from the day before were still hanging in the air, like a line no one dared to cross. Then my lawyer stood. His tone was calm, deliberate. "Your Honor, the defense calls Brigadier General Robert Harris back to the stand." The room stirred. The prosecutor objected, but the judge raised his hand. "Overruled. I want to hear what he has to say." General Harris walked to the stand, uniform pressed, ribbons neat, eyes clear. He moved like a man who had spent a lifetime giving and following orders, yet the gravity in his steps was personal. When he raised his right hand for the oath, I noticed the faint tremor in his fingers. Not from fear, but from memory, the lawyer began. "General Harris, you stated yesterday that Sergeant Nora Ellis saved your life during a combat mission. Can you describe what happened?" The general nodded. His voice carried through the courtroom, deep and even. "It was Helmand Province, August 2015. Our convoy took heavy fire after an improvised explosive detonated under the lead vehicle. 3 soldiers were down, 2 unconscious. Sergeant Ellis ran straight into the blast zone. No cover, no backup, just instinct." He paused, his eyes meeting mine briefly before turning back to the jury. "She dragged me out of that vehicle with shrapnel in her own leg. She stayed until the last man was stabilized. She refused evacuation until everyone else was clear. That's who she is." You could have heard a pin drop. Even the judge sat forward slightly, elbows resting on the desk. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on his notes, pretending to review them. Harris continued, his voice low now, but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You're questioning her character because of a fall. I've seen her face incoming fire without flinching. I've seen her save lives most people would run from, whatever happened in that house. I promise you this, she is not capable of cruelty." He looked at the judge. "She is capable of courage, and she's shown more of it in this courtroom than most people show in a lifetime." The judge leaned back, silent for a moment, as if weighing the air. "Thank you, General." Harris nodded once and stepped down. He passed by my seat, pausing just long enough to say quietly, "You've already won, Sergeant. They just don't know it yet." When my mother was called next, the room tensed again. She walked slowly, each step unsteady but deliberate. The clerk swore her in. She sat, clutching her tissue, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. My lawyer didn't rush. "Mrs. Ellis," he said gently, "yesterday you mentioned that your former husband, Frank, contacted you before the incident. Can you tell the court what he said?" She hesitated, her lips parted, then closed again. For a long moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with a shaky breath, she said, "He told me Nora would hurt me, that she was dangerous." Her voice cracked. "He said the Army had broken her." The lawyer nodded. "And did you believe him?" "I did," she whispered. He had a way of making me doubt everything, even her. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. He called me every night that week. He said people like her came back angry. That one day she'd snap. When I fell, I panicked. I told the police what he made me believe. I thought if I said she pushed me, maybe she'd come home. Maybe she'd stop running from me. I didn't know I was helping him hurt her again. Her words broke something inside the room. It wasn't loud, but it was real. You could feel it in the shift of breath, the weight of silence. The prosecutor lowered his head. The judge's expression softened. My lawyer stood still, letting the truth settle. My mother turned toward me, tears soaking the edges of her tissue. I was wrong, she said quietly. She never hurt me. She saved me, just not the way I thought she would. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. The air thick in my chest. The prosecutor didn't cross-examine her. He didn't have to. The judge looked down, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He stayed quiet for a long time before finally speaking. This court has heard enough. His tone was calm but heavy. Sergeant Ellis, you've served this country with honor. You've shown dignity even in the face of injustice. He looked toward the jury, then back at me. Case dismissed. The gavel struck once. A single sound that felt like the breaking of a chain. People began to stand, some clapping softly despite the formality. The general gave a small salute from the back row. My lawyer smiled, relief written all over his face. My mother covered her face with her hands and wept quietly. I stood there frozen, unsure if I should feel joy or sorrow. Justice had come, but it didn't erase the years of silence that brought us here. I looked up at the skylight above the courtroom and saw a sliver of sunlight cut through the clouds, landing on the polished floor. That moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like a release, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for a lifetime. If this story moves something in you, tap the like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened after the courtroom doors closed, how I faced my mother again, and how the Army called one last time with an unexpected offer that would change everything. When the judge's gavel echoed for the last time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the world was pausing, trying to remember how to breathe again. My lawyer leaned close and whispered that I was free to go, but the word free sounded strange in my ears, like something I hadn't earned yet. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters whispered from the hallway, cameras flashing through the glass doors, hungry for a statement. But I didn't want to be anyone's story. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind I could finally choose. General Harris waited by the exit. He had already changed out of his uniform into a plain gray jacket, but his presence carried the same authority. He shook my hand again, firm and brief. You did more than clear your name, he said. You reminded them what integrity looks like. I thanked him quietly. He nodded once, then turned to leave, the rhythm of his steps steady as ever. Watching him walk away, I felt a quiet kind of grief, not for him, but for the version of myself that had needed someone like him to believe me first. Outside, the air was warmer than it had been all week. My mother stood near the bottom of the steps, clutching her handbag, shoulders drawn tight. The crowd parted slightly when she looked up and saw me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I walked toward her. Her voice trembled. Nora, I don't know what to say. I stopped a few feet away. You already said enough, I answered softly. She nodded, eyes glistening. I'm sorry for all of it. I thought I was protecting you by keeping peace, but silence isn't peace, is it? I shook my head. No, it's just another kind of cage. She took a hesitant step closer. Do you hate me? The question came out small, like it had been waiting years to escape. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. No, I said. But I need time to learn how to trust again. That's going to take a while. She nodded. We stood there quietly, the noise of reporters fading into the distance. When she reached out her hand, I took it. Her fingers were cold, but the grip was steady. That night, I went back to my apartment and sat on the floor beside the duffel bag I hadn't unpacked since the trial began. My uniform was folded inside, neat and untouched, the tags still tucked under the collar. I ran my hand over the fabric and thought of all the places it had been: dust storms, blood-soaked tents, late-night patrols under a desert sky. It wasn't just a uniform. It was a timeline stitched with the pieces of me that had survived. On the kitchen table lay the letter I had received 2 weeks earlier from Fort Sam Houston. I hadn't opened it. My lawyer had told me not to distract myself until the verdict. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, I finally tore the seal. It was an official notice. The Army was reinstating my status for active training support, a short-term assignment under the Medical Training Command. My record had been reviewed and cleared. They wanted me back. I read the words twice, then set the paper down. My hands were shaking. Part of me wanted to pack right then to return to the one place that had made me feel steady. But another part of me hesitated. The Army had given me purpose, but it had also given me distance from my family, from myself, from everything I never dealt with. For the first time, I wondered if healing meant staying still instead of running forward. The next morning, I drove to the coast. The ocean was gray, restless, the waves breaking against the rocks in small bursts of foam. I hadn't been there since before deployment. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, my dog tags resting in my palm. They had once been symbols of duty. Now they felt like proof that I could survive anything. I thought about what the judge said, "You've served this country with honor." It echoed in my mind, not as praise, but as a question. What did it mean to serve with honor when your own life was in pieces? Maybe honor wasn't about medals or courtroom victories. Maybe it was about standing up again after losing everything that made you stand in the first place. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. It was a message from General Harris, just 2 words, "Proud of you." I smiled, typing back, "Thank you, sir." Then I added something before sending it, "For everything." Later that evening, my mother called. Her voice was calm, tentative. "I started going to counseling," she said. "It's hard, but I think it's time I stopped being afraid of my own house." I felt something warm in my chest, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "That's good, Mom," I said. "That's the right start." Before hanging up, she asked, "Will you come visit soon?" I hesitated, looking around my quiet apartment. "Not yet," I said gently, "but one day," when I hung up. I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before. Not the kind you find in silence, but the kind you build after the noise fades, the kind that grows when truth finally has a voice. I stood by the window, watching the city lights blink below. I touched the chain around my neck, feeling the weight of the tags against my skin. They didn't feel heavy anymore, they felt earned. If you've ever fought to rebuild yourself after losing everything, let this story remind you that truth doesn't destroy, it rebuilds. Tap the like button, leave a comment if you believe in redemption, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, when Nora must decide between peace and purpose, the 2 things she's never been able to hold at the same time. The day after the verdict, I woke before sunrise. The city outside my window was quiet, still wrapped in that gray-blue calm before the world remembered to make noise again. I made a cup of coffee, stood barefoot in the kitchen, and let the steam fog the window as I looked out. The air smelled clean, like rain had passed sometime in the night. For the first time in years, there was no hearing to attend, no lawyer to meet, no questions waiting to be answered. Just silence. The kind I had once feared, the kind I could finally live with. My uniform hung over the back of a chair. I hadn't worn it in months. The fabric still carried traces of sand from the last field deployment, the faint scent of iron and dust that never completely fades. I ran my hand over the sleeve and thought about all the moments it had witnessed, the noise, the chaos, the faces of soldiers who trusted me with their lives. That uniform had seen me through everything. And somehow it had brought me here too, to a different kind of battlefield. I decided to wear it again one last time before reporting back to base, not out of pride, but out of closure. I wanted to walk through the same courthouse doors that once felt like a prison and leave them behind on my own terms. When I arrived, the steps were still damp from the morning drizzle. The security guard at the door recognized me but didn't say anything. He just nodded respectfully. Inside, the corridors were empty except for the faint echo of my boots on the polished floor. The courtroom itself was locked now, the lights off. I stood outside for a long moment, listening to the stillness. This was where the noise had finally stopped. This was where truth had found its voice. As I turned to leave, I heard the soft sound of heels on the marble behind me. My mother's reflection appeared in the glass of the courtroom door before I even turned around. She looked smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a gray coat that seemed a size too big. Her eyes met mine, cautious but steady. "I was wrong," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried years of weight. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I know, Mom, just keep healing." She nodded, lips trembling as if she wanted to say more but couldn't. I didn't need her to. There was nothing left to explain. I reached out and gently squeezed her hand. It felt fragile, cold, but alive. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a child trying to be strong for her. I just felt like her daughter. We walked outside together, down the courthouse steps that had felt like mountains not long ago. The sun was rising now, breaking through the clouds in streaks of gold. For a moment, it caught the surface of my dog tags, sending a flash of light across the stone. My mother blinked and smiled faintly. "You always did find your own way," she said softly. I smiled back. "Guess I learned from the best." We stood there watching the morning light fill the street, the air warming as people began to pass by. No one knew what had happened inside that courtroom. To them, we were just 2 women standing quietly on the steps, one in uniform, one in a coat too big for her shoulders. But to me, that moment felt like the end of a long war, the kind you fight without weapons, the kind you win by finally letting go. Later that afternoon, I drove out to Fort Sam Houston to meet with the training command. The base looked the same rows of white barracks, flags snapping in the wind, the sound of cadence calls echoing across the field. I parked near the medical center, the place where it all began. Walking through the entrance, I felt something shift inside me. The familiar rhythm of military life, the footsteps, the salutes, the precise movements felt grounding again. A young private at the desk looked up and smiled nervously. "Sergeant Ellis," he said, glancing at my name tag. "Ma'am, they said you'd be stopping by. Welcome back." "Thank you," I said. "It's good to be here." He handed me a visitor's pass and asked if I'd like to wait in the briefing room. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear laughter from a nearby classroom, the sound of instructors joking with recruits. It made me smile. For so long, I had associated the Army with pain and distance. Now, for the first time, it sounded like home again. In the briefing room, I found a familiar face, Major Grayson, one of my old mentors. He looked up from a stack of papers, surprise flashing across his expression before it softened into a grin. "Well, if it isn't our miracle medic." "Don't start with that again," I said, shaking my head. He chuckled. "You think surviving Helmand and surviving that courtroom aren't miracles? You proved something a lot of people forget. That honor isn't about rank or medals, it's about who you are when the noise stops." I smiled faintly. "Maybe, I just want to teach again, train the next ones right." "That's exactly why we wanted you back," he said. "We need people like you in front of them, not behind a desk." He handed me a thin folder. Inside was my new assignment order, training medics for emergency field response, a short-term leadership program. I looked up at him. "So I'm back in uniform?" He grinned. "Looks like it." When I stepped outside again, the sun was brighter, the wind sharper. I looked across the base at the soldiers marching in formation, the flags waving high, and I felt something close to peace. For years, I had fought to prove my worth, to be seen, to be believed. Now I didn't have to prove anything. I just had to live it. That night, I sat by my window again, the same city stretching out below. My uniform hung by the door, my orders on the table, my mother's voice still echoing in my head. I closed my eyes and let the silence fill the room, not the old kind that suffocates, but the new kind that heals. Some battles aren't fought overseas. Some happen in kitchens, courtrooms, and quiet conversations that come years too late. But in the end, honor always finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and share it with someone who's fighting a quiet battle of their own. And if you believe that courage doesn't end when the war does, subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter, because sometimes the hardest victory is learning how to live in peace. The next morning, I woke before dawn again, out of habit more than anything else. Old routines die hard. I brewed coffee, packed my duffel, and sat at the small kitchen table staring at the orders that would take me back to Fort Sam Houston. My hands rested on the paper like I was trying to feel the weight of the decision through it. Outside, the city was quiet, a soft orange light touching the tops of the buildings. Before I left, I stopped by my mother's house. The curtains were open this time. For years she kept them drawn as if sunlight might expose something fragile. Now the windows glowed faintly from the inside. She was sitting by the table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. When she saw me in uniform, she smiled, tired but proud. "You look like yourself again," she said. I sat down across from her. "I think I finally do," I said. The silence between us wasn't sharp anymore. It was easy, even kind. She slid one of the cups toward me. "When you were little, you used to pretend the kitchen floor was a battlefield," she said. "You'd crawl around with a plastic first aid kit, patching up your dolls." I laughed quietly. "Guess I was training early." She smiled. "You were always meant to heal things. I just wish I hadn't made myself one of them." Her voice broke a little on that last line. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. We both had things to heal. "Mom, we still do." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Then I hope we both keep trying." We talked for almost an hour about nothing dramatic, her garden, my next assignment, the neighbor's new dog, small things, but sometimes healing hides in the small things. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the porch. The morning light was warm now, the kind that makes everything look softer. She reached up and fixed the edge of my collar. A gesture so familiar it almost made me cry. "Take care of yourself out there," she said. "I will," I replied. "You too." She hesitated, then added, "You're not just my daughter, you're my reminder that truth matters, even when it hurts." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I turned to go, but before I reached the car, she called out one last time. "Nora." I looked back. "I'm proud of you." It was simple, but it landed deep. For years I had chased that sentence in one way or another. Hearing it now didn't feel like validation. It felt like closure. The drive to base took 3 hours. The road wound through open fields and stretches of highway lined with old oak trees. I rolled the windows down, letting the wind carry away the last of the courthouse air that had clung to me. When I reached Fort Sam Houston, the guard at the gate checked my ID and saluted with a grin. "Welcome home, Sergeant," he said. Those words hit harder than I expected. Home. It wasn't the first time someone had said it to me, but it was the first time it felt true. Inside the base, everything looked both familiar and changed. The same red brick buildings, the same cadence calls echoing from the training field. But I noticed faces I didn't recognize, new recruits, younger, full of the same uncertainty I once carried. Their energy made me smile. I checked in with personnel, got my quarters assignment, and reported to the training center. The first day back wasn't dramatic, no big ceremony. No speeches, just a stack of medical kits, a group of new trainees, and a lecture hall that smelled faintly of disinfectant and floor polish. I introduced myself simply. I'm Sergeant Nora Ellis. I'll be teaching field triage and emergency response. Everything I'm about to show you, I learned the hard way. So listen close, because one day someone's life might depend on what you remember. They straightened up immediately. One of them raised a hand and asked, "Were you really in Helmand?" I smiled. Yes, but what matters isn't where I was, it's who I learned to be. I showed them how to apply a tourniquet using one hand, how to stay calm when the noise around you turns to chaos. I told them the truth, that fear never leaves, it just learns to work beside you. They listened wide-eyed, scribbling notes faster than I could speak. Watching them, I realized something I hadn't before. The battlefield might have changed, but my purpose hadn't. I was still meant to protect, to steady the hands of those who would one day save others. At lunch, I stepped outside into the courtyard. The air smelled like heat and metal. I closed my eyes and listened, the distant marching, the laughter, the cadence of boots on gravel. It sounded like life. I touched the dog tags around my neck. They felt warm from the sun. That evening, I got a message from my mother, just a single photo of her garden, small purple flowers blooming by the fence. The caption said, "They're growing again." I stared at it for a long time, then replied, "So am I." Later, before bed, I recorded a short message for the base newsletter. They wanted every instructor to share a quote about service. I didn't have to think long. "Some battles aren't fought overseas," I said into the recorder. "Some happen quietly in the hearts of those we love, but honor always finds its way home." I ended the recording, sat back, and let those words settle in the stillness. Outside, the sky was deep blue, a few stars peeking through the Texas haze. Somewhere far beyond that sky was the version of me who once thought survival was enough. Now I knew better. Survival is just the beginning. What you do after, that's where honor lives. If this story meant something to you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means rebuilding. And don't forget to subscribe for the next story. Because sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that teach us what strength really is.